Hello friend, welcome to Nighttime Horror. On this channel, we post the most fascinating and scariest stories told by real people. Make sure you like, subscribe, and watch till the end. Let's get started. Story number 1. The Forgotten Road. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. 4 friends Mike, Sarah, Dave, and Jenna packed up their car and headed out to a remote cabin in the woods, far from the noise and stress of the city. Mike had found the place online, a rustic spot nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, perfect for hiking and unwinding. No self-service, no distractions, just the 4 of them and the peace of the wilderness. The drive started off well enough. Spirits were high, the radio was blasting, and they laughed about the escape from their everyday lives. But as the sun began to set, the GPS started acting strange. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't match the map. They passed a small, broken sign that read it Old Hollow Road, a name none of them recognized, but the GPS insisted this was the way. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah asked from the back seat, glancing nervously at the darkening forest around them. Mike, who was driving, shrugged. "The GPS says so. We'll probably just get there a little later than expected." As they continued down the narrow, winding path, the trees thickened on either side, their twisted branches forming an almost unnatural canopy that blocked out the fading light. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for the car. Jenna, in the passenger seat, shivered and rubbed her arms, glancing out at the oppressive forest. "This place gives me the creeps," she said softly. Dave, always the joker, turned around and grinned. "What, afraid of a few trees, Jean?" But as the words left his mouth, the car hit a sudden bump, jolting everyone inside. The engine sputtered, the headlights flickered, and the car coasted to a slow stop. Mike cursed under his breath and tried to start the car again. The engine cranked but wouldn't catch. "Great," he muttered. "Probably just a dead battery or something." The 4 of them sat in the growing darkness, the silence heavy around them. Sarah glanced at her phone. No service, as expected. They were miles away from any town or gas station, and the forest seemed to swallow up the road behind them. The air outside was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the woods were holding their breath. "We should walk to the cabin," Mike suggested after a few moments. "It's not too far from here. Maybe a mile or 2. We'll call for help once we get there." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They grabbed their bags, leaving the car behind, and started down the road on foot. As they walked, the quietness around them grew unsettling. No birds, no rustling leaf, just the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel road. The trees loomed overhead, their branches curling like skeletal fingers against the night sky. After about 20 minutes, Jenna stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" The others paused, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of rustling leaves came from the woods. It wasn't the wind, it was something moving. "Probably just a deer," Dave said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. They kept walking, but the rustling continued, growing closer. Mike tightened his grip on his flashlight, his eyes scanning the trees nervously. They had no way of knowing that the woods were not empty, and they weren't alone. After another few minutes, they came to a clearing. There, in the middle of the woods, stood a crumbling, old house. It was weathered and falling apart, looking like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its windows were shattered, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the gentle breeze. "That's not the cabin," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "No, it's not," Mike replied, his throat tightening. The cabin was supposed to be new, modern. This place looked like it had been forgotten for generations. As they stood there, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder, and an overpowering smell of smoke filled the air. The rustling from the woods grew louder, closer, and then they saw them figures moving between the trees. "Let's get out of here," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. Now. But it was too late. The figures stepped out from the tree line, shadowy and distorted, their forms barely human. Some were hunched over like animals, others stood tall, their faces hidden in shadow. But the worst part was their eyes burning red embers in the darkness. The friends backed away slowly, but the figures began to close in, surrounding them. There was no escape. Suddenly, one of the creatures let out a blood-curdling scream, and the forest seemed to come alive with movement. Dozens of them surged forward, crawling and stumbling toward the group. Mike turned and ran, pulling Jenna by the arm, with Sarah and Dave close behind. They sprinted toward the house, the only place to hide, as the things from the woods gave chase. The doors slammed behind them just as the first creature reached the porch, its long, clawed hands scratching at the wood. The friends bolted it shut, but the windows rattled violently as the things outside howled and banged on the walls. "What the hell are those things?" Dave gasped, leaning against the door, his face pale with fear. "I don't know," Mike answered, his voice shaking, "but we're trapped." The smell of smoke returned, thick and acrid, filling the house. Sarah, who had been trying to calm down, suddenly pointed at the ceiling. "Guys, the house, it's burning." They all looked up. Flames began to lick the walls, but there was no source. The fire didn't start naturally, it seemed to appear out of thin air, consuming the house at an unnatural speed. The temperature in the room spiked, the heat intense and suffocating. "We have to get out of here," Jenna screamed. But as they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, and the flames grew faster, crawling up the walls and across the floor. The shadowy figures from the woods pressed their faces against the windows, their ember eyes watching hungrily as the fire closed in. The friends were surrounded, trapped by the fire and the creatures outside. Mike tried to kick down the door, but it wouldn't move, as if the house itself was alive, determined to keep them inside. The heat became unbearable, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. They coughed and choked, their lungs burning. As the flames engulfed the room, Jenna collapsed, and one by one, the others fell to their knees, gasping for air. The last thing Mike saw before the smoke swallowed him was the figure of a man standing in the flames, untouched by the fire, watching him with eyes like burning coals. The house burned to the ground that night, leaving no trace of the four friends or their car. The road they had driven down, Old Hollow Road, wasn't on any map, and the cabin Mike had rented didn't exist. In the end, the friends were never found, their weekend getaway turning into a nightmare that consumed them, leaving only whispers in the dark and embers in the trees. Story number 2. The Trip to Black Hollow. Mike and Jake had been best friends since childhood, always seeking adventure. One summer weekend, they decided to take a road trip deep into the countryside, far from the city noise. Their destination, Black Hollow, a small, forgotten town rumored to be haunted, but more importantly to them, it was known for its isolation and incredible hiking trails. They packed their gear, snacks, and a cooler full of beer, eager for a fun getaway. As they drove through winding country roads, the sky grew darker. Thick clouds rolled in, and the sun vanished behind them, turning the late afternoon into an early twilight. The GPS signal on Mike's phone kept cutting out, but they shrugged it off, figuring they could follow the old highway signs to the town. The farther they went, the more desolate the surroundings became. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jake asked, glancing out the window at the darkening woods. "Yeah, the GPS was working earlier. We're close," Mike replied, though a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. A few miles later, they saw the sign, Black Hollow, 5 miles. They shared a relieved laugh, but just as Mike sped up, something darted across the road, a large, shadowy figure, too fast to fully make out. Mike slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching. They both jolted forward, the car coming to a sudden stop. "What the hell was that?" Jake shouted, his heart racing. Mike shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tight. "I don't know, maybe a deer." But in the pit of their stomachs, they knew it hadn't looked like any animal they'd ever seen. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, scanning the road ahead. Nothing moved. The forest was unnervingly still. Mike slowly eased the car forward. But now the fun road trip vibes had vanished, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. A few minutes later, the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, and the car slowed to a stop. "Great. Now what?" Jake groaned, glancing at the dashboard as the engine completely died. Mike tried to start the car again, but it wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, he pounded the steering wheel. Battery must have died or something. "I thought I checked everything before we left." They sat in tense silence, the dark road ahead seemingly endless. The woods were so thick now that the trees blocked out most of the remaining light. Jake grabbed his phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. Both of their phones showed nothing but blank bars. "Looks like we're walking," Mike said grimly. "Black Hollow's just 5 miles up, right? We'll find a mechanic or someone who can help." With no other option, they grabbed their backpacks, flashlights, unlocked the car, setting off down the empty road. The temperature had dropped sharply, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel as they walked in eerie silence, the forest pressing in on them from all sides. As they walked, they both became aware of a soft sound behind them, like distant footsteps. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but as they walked faster, so did the sound. Mike stopped suddenly, turning his flashlight toward the woods. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "It's like something's following us." They scanned the forest, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark. The trees cast long, twisted shadows, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. "Let's keep moving," Mike muttered, gripping his flashlight tighter. The faster they walked, the more intense the feeling became. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. They began hearing strange noises, soft whispers, almost too low to understand, but unmistakably human. And worse, the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. After what felt like an eternity, they finally saw the faint lights of Black Hollow in the distance. A small town, just a few houses and one main street. But something about the town seemed wrong. The houses looked abandoned, their windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. The street lights flickered, casting everything in an eerie glow. Mike and Jake rushed toward the nearest house, hoping to find help. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and an odd, musty smell. The house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. "There's no one here," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, they heard a low growl coming from the back of the house. They froze, staring at each other in fear. The growl was followed by heavy footsteps, dragging toward them. Without thinking, they bolted out of the house and into the street. But the town wasn't safe either. Figures, human shapes, but distorted, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, stood in the distance, watching them from the shadows of the abandoned houses. Their whispering voices filled the air, surrounding Mike and Jake. "Run," Mike shouted, grabbing Jake's arm, as they sprinted toward the edge of town. But as they ran, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The road twisted, turning into an endless loop. No matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding them, growing closer with each passing second. And then, from the forest behind them, the same dark, shadowy creature they had seen earlier emerged. It was massive, its body twisted and deformed, more animal than human, but with empty, glowing eyes that locked onto them. Jake screamed as it charged toward them. They ran, but it was no use. The whispering grew louder, the figures closing in. The creature moved faster, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Mike and Jake ran with everything they had, but they could feel it closing in, its hot breath on their necks. In the end, there was no escape. The creature pounced, and the last thing either of them heard was the deafening roar as darkness consumed them. The town of Black Hollow remained silent, as it always had, waiting for the next unlucky souls to wander into its grasp. Story number 3. The Night Walk. Emma and David had been together 4 years and loved taking evening walks, especially in the quiet outskirts of town, where the noise of city life faded away, and they could enjoy the peace of nature. One summer evening, after a late dinner, they decided to go for a walk down a quiet, scenic road near the woods, a path they hadn't explored much before. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was crisp with the smell of pine and earth. They chatted softly as they strolled, their laughter echoing in the still night. But as they walked deeper down the road, the comforting sounds of nature crickets, rustling leaves faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Emma noticed first. "It's too quiet," she whispered, gripping David's arm. "I don't like it," David nodded, sensing it too, but smiled to ease her nerves. "We're just not used to it. Let's go a bit further and then turn back." They continued walking when, in the distance, they noticed the faint glow of headlights. The road wasn't heavily traveled, so the approaching car stood out. It seemed harmless at first, but as the car got closer, they realized it was moving much faster than it should on such a narrow, dark road. The engine roared as the car sped towards them, headlights blinding. "We should step aside," David said, pulling Emma toward the grassy edge of the road. But the car wasn't slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be speeding up. Panic set in as they jumped out of the way, just barely avoiding the vehicle as it screeched past them, its taillights glowing red in the dark. For a moment, they stood frozen, hearts racing, trying to catch their breath. "What the hell?" Emma gasped. "Did they try to hit us?" David frowned, looking back at the road. "I don't know, but they were way too close. Let's head back." But before they could turn around, the car's brake lights flashed ahead, and it screeched to a halt, about 100 feet down the road. The car just sat there, its engine idling ominously. "David, we need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Now." David agreed, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. They turned toward the woods, deciding to cut through the forest and avoid the road entirely. As they ran toward the trees, they heard the car rev its engine again, tires screeching as it turned back toward them. Without thinking, they sprinted into the dark forest, branches whipping at their faces and the ground uneven beneath their feet. Once inside the forest, the thick trees blocked out the moonlight, making it hard to see. They could hear the car stop by the road, followed by the sound of doors slamming shut. Whoever was in the car was now on foot and coming after them. "We need to hide," David whispered, pulling Emma deeper into the woods. "Let's get farther in." They ran through the dense undergrowth, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the road. The sounds of footsteps from behind faded, but the forest had its own dangers. As they stumbled over roots and dodged low-hanging branches, the forest seemed to close in on them, darker and more menacing with every step. They stopped to catch their breath by a large tree, the silence of the woods now deafening. "Do you think we lost them?" Emma asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," David replied, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. "But let's stay quiet for a minute." That's when they heard it. Low, guttural growls, deep in the woods around them. They froze, their eyes widening in terror. The growls were followed by the sound of something large moving through the brush, circling them. It wasn't human. What is that?" Emma whispered, gripping David's arm tightly. Before he could answer, a shape moved in the darkness. A set of glowing eyes reflected back at them from between the trees, followed by another pair, and then another, wolves. But something about these creatures seemed off, more than just wild animals. There was a strange, almost unnatural darkness to them. "We need to go," David whispered, grabbing Emma's hand. They slowly backed away, but the wolves followed, their growls growing louder, more aggressive. Just as they turned to run, one of the wolves lunged, snapping its jaws inches from David's leg. He swung his flashlight at it, but it barely slowed the creature down. They sprinted through the forest, their lungs burning, hearts pounding, the sound of the pack chasing them through the underbrush. They kept running until they burst into a small clearing, but what they saw stopped them cold. At the edge of the clearing stood several figures, pale, ghostly shapes, half visible in the moonlight. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their faces obscured by shadows, but their presence was undeniable. These weren't people, not anymore. The ghosts stood still, but their heads turned slowly to face Emma and David, as if acknowledging their presence. The wolves, now behind them, stopped their chase and circled the clearing, growling low, as if waiting for something. Emma's voice trembled as she gripped David's hand. "We're trapped." The ghostly figures began to move forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as if time itself was bending around them. The wolves circled closer, their glowing eyes locked on the couple. David looked around desperately for a way out, but there was none. The forest, the clearing, the wolves, and the ghosts all seemed to trap them in a nightmare they couldn't escape. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, chilling them to the bone. The ghostly figures reached out their pale hands, their whispers filling the air, growing louder, more intense. The wolves crouched, ready to strike, as if waiting for the ghost signal. In a final moment of terror, David and Emma realized they weren't just being hunted by wild animals or haunted by spirits. They had wandered into something far older, far darker, a place where the living didn't belong. The wolves lunged, the ghostly figures closed in, and then everything went black. The next morning, hikers found the couple's abandoned car on the side of the road. Their bodies were never found, and the locals whispered of Black Hollow Forest, where people sometimes vanished, claimed by the ghosts and wolves that guarded the cursed woods. It was a place where no one returned from the night,